All right, so let's do another one, but this time let's start it out with Prismacolor. Prismacolor. And as much as you can, just if you can kind of sort of make these a little bit mindless. The initial shape and form. Like don't feel like you got to make something really beautiful or precious. Let's say we decide for whatever reason we go, ooh, I like this weird globule of a shape. Maybe I'll cut out. Let's cut out something in this. Let's cut something out like right there. Right. Oh, and let's just say just for fun, let's put something underneath here like it's almost peeking through, but there's another part that's kind of falling through the bottom. In the beginning, almost all these drawings, we always try to do them light. We almost never try to start any drawings by muscling through them. We can mix everything. So prior to this, we've been kind of isolating, Prismacolor, pen, and not really bringing all of them together. But just for the sake of, let's say we decide that this is the center line on this, and that this is the volume of this. And then understanding the volume of things is really important because it'll help you as you start to think about wrapping texture around things. It'll kind of sort of get in the way depending on how you normally work. If you're not really that accustomed to like giving things dimensions, sometimes it can be a bit challenging as you get to the point where you decide like that's thin, but then this has more roundness and volume to it, and then maybe that has some degree of thinness to it, but there's maybe like a continual thickness, and let's say that thickness gradually sort of declines and kind of melds in. So if you were designing some sort of product, it'd be pretty easy to design some really interesting sort of organic product that somebody might be able to fabricate or manufacture. So let's say this plane is fairly flat, but this part does still have a roll around to it, right? Like that's an important distinction because that'll help us to make decisions about like how we would bring the volume of things around. So I'm not gonna make a big like checker pattern on there, although just for the sake of, let's say that continues the sort of dimensional quality and wraps back around into there. So let's say that's the dimension of my thing, but maybe here, instead of making this flat, let's have that wrap back around so that effectively the volume of this maintains some degree of thickness. Like there's still some degree of thickness that wraps around this part of this volume, right? So we can make a distinction about, hey, that still has some degree of volume and wrap around to it. And then again, the idea behind it is that you could more easily give things dimension because you can look at any shape or form and apply some structure to it, right? Like you don't need like very specific shapes and forms. Ideally, when you're doing this, if you can look at picture reference of things, it's going to help you in the decision making process because then you're not going to be winging it as much, because once you start winging it, it becomes a little bit more difficult and a little bit more problematic. So the more we can kind of simplify this and look at some textures as we do this, it's definitely going to help. And so at this point, I'm just looking at I'm looking at some wood patterns to get an idea of like some of the linear breakups that happen with a lot of wood, so I can make a decision about like how do I want to handle if I were to try to apply some sort of wood or wood-esque pattern to this. So and again, if you've practiced making the swatches, this kind of sort of, I hate to say easy because easy always sounds bad when somebody says it should be easy, and a lot of times it isn't. But let's say, because most wood will typically have some sort of rings in it, so let's add maybe a ring here, and then we'll add like another sort of ring there, and then we'll break break this so it's not super perfect, right? And then we'll add like some of those other like sort of spiraling patterns, and then we'll break this up by adding maybe something that feels a bit more thick here, and that goes a little bit thin, and then maybe something like that. So there's some variation in the thickness of things. And then we'll put a couple more lines in here, but we don't want to make this super busy. Just want to give the impression that it feels, you know, somewhat like wood, right? And again, always keep in mind that like your goal is not like how can I make this super perfect, right? Like your goal is to try to create the feeling, the impression as much as you possibly can. So let's say that we try to get this pattern to sort of ride around some of these, so we can determine which direction we want it to go in. More than likely, I probably would try to make it follow along the rings of this, so that it has more of a wrap around to it, so it doesn't feel flat. This is definitely trial and error, so don't feel like if you don't master this and you don't get it right the first time that you're like, I failed, forget it. Right, so we'll just try to like, let's say we'll just try to make some little rings on this to make it feel like it's like wood that would be wrapping around. And then definitely keep in mind that like it's highly unlikely that wood in real life would do any of this at all. Right, like there's no wood that's gonna do this, but we'll try to force a wood pattern on that wraps around like that, right? It'd be the easier cheat thing to do is to create the wood pattern here, because we got all kind of flatness, and it's definitely gonna make the job of, you know, determining like, okay, then this would just, that little bit would fall over the edge. We get a nice little like sort of ring in here. We probably would get that little sort of eye that happens sometimes with the rings on wood, and then we can, you know, play with the relative thickness, and we can add a little bit more of like, hey, lines that you know break and then come back, and they break and come back. Maybe we'll add a couple more lines in here that get closer. Try to explore some thick and thin options. Right, so this is just an opportunity for us to just kind of play around and think about like texturally, like what are the things that we want to do, and how do we want to handle like some of the patterning. And maybe we do decide, hey, we should add some thick to thin that would happen on the edge there, and maybe play around with making some of this feel also a bit more organic, in that maybe these wood patterns sort of start to swirl and spiral, just because visually maybe it's interesting. Right, it's not the natural pattern of what would happen with wood, but again, this is like a playful sort of design. This is not exacting like it has to be perfect, right? So let's come in with Prismacolor, see what we can do with these wood-like textures. So let's say, for the sake of, let me do it on here first before I start winging it, because again, it's always tempting to just wing it. It's always a temptation is let's just wing it. Boop. And again, we always start light. We always start as light as we possibly can, so that we always have the option of coming back in and adding more value. So I'm gonna build up some of the thickness on this, like right through the middle of this line. And I am petting the lines, and typically I usually say, hey, don't pet the lines, but because we do need to build some thick and thin here, we kind of do need to. And petting the line just means that you draw over the line multiple times. It's not an actual pet. Like, come here, line. Although you can talk to your lines if you want to. You will look really weird to most people, but I mean, you're an artist anyway, so you're kind of weird by default. That sounds so bad. I probably shouldn't have said that. And somebody's gonna be like, but I'm not weird. And then I always tell people, well, go ask somebody. And if you're really uncomfortable with the idea of being weird, don't ask people. Because they'll be like, oh yeah, you didn't know you were weird? And then you'll be like, no, no. All right, let's see what we can do with this. So we'll wrap this around and we'll add a little bit of thickness in there and then we'll let it kind of trail. This eye part, maybe on this eye part, we'll put like a couple little lines in there to make it look like it's a little bit of it has a little bit of fracture or fray to it. And then we'll just wrap that around and then we'll wrap some of this around. Right? And then keeping in mind too that we don't have to solve all of our issues with Prismacolor. We could still come back in with, you know, our other marker and add in a little bit more line weight and value too, but we're just kind of exploring our mark making here. Boop. That doesn't look particularly woodish there. Let's see if we can add a little bit more linear marks there that would make that appear. It's starting to look like a face. It's looking like a face. And then two, keep in mind with these things is that in any of the mistakes or the quote unquote mistakes that you make in any of these drawings and you accidentally stumble on something interesting, you always want to store that in your sort of mental Rolodex too, to go, ooh, I remember this one time I was drawing this, what was supposed to be a wood pattern, but I made this really cool, weird looking eye. And I want to figure out how I can use that for something else. Right? Because these like sketchbooks like this are they're not designed for you to do the best drawings you've ever done in your entire life. Like these are purely so that you are getting what they call reps in. So if you've ever played sports, oftentimes you're just, you know, you're doing training to prepare you for when you really have to do the thing that you're training for, right? Like you're running laps, not because you necessarily love running laps, but you're really running laps to prepare yourself for the endurance that you'll have to deal with when you're playing some sort of sport. All right, so I think that's okay. I don't need to get wild with this. So I will add a little bit more thickness. And so when we're looking at line weights, the heavier our line weight is, the more that it will read as a direction, a form change. Oftentimes we can sort of simulate that that's the shadow side without having to really do a lot of rendering. Like always keep that in mind too when you start to have heavier line weight. If you have a heavy line weight, it'll order space. And so anywhere where you have things that are overlapping, if you add just a slightly heavier line weight, it'll almost instantly say that is overlapping the other thing. So I'm going to add a heavier line weight here to make that little separation. And I can keep that thin. I might add a little bit of line weight up there just to give that a little more dimension. But I'm going to give a lot of line weight down here to give this a bit more thickness as well. All right, let's try some markers. Let's mix this up. Right, let's mix it up. So I'm going to build some transition. I want to make this part a little darker. And then I will come back in with my other marker. Got a little transition in there. And I'll come back in with this. I have a brush side, so I'm going to come back in with a brush side and just sort of firm up some of these just so I could add a little more thickness in some areas, because I'm going to come back in with my Prisma, the white Prisma, and pop some highlights, and it's going to make that, in theory, it should make that sing. I'm going to make that a little bit darker just so it looks like there's a bit more depth and dimension to that. Boom, wood plank. I'm going to fake a shadow here just to add another layer of depth. Not necessary, but it adds dimension. And who doesn't like dimension, right? I'll maybe add a little value here, and then I'll come back in and thicken up around some of these, so especially around the eye there, and I'll add a little bit more weight on some of these just to make it pop a little more. Since this is the form change on this, I'm gonna come in and add just the edge of value around here. You could meticulously do this with Prismacolor. By all means, you could. The only reason I'm not is because it would take more time, and I also don't want to do a Prismacolor because I don't want to start noodling. It is so very easy to noodle yourself into oblivion when you start rendering things with pencils, mostly because people have been using pencils a lot in their drawing career or their drawing lifespan, so they feel very comfortable with going to town with the pencil. And part of the goal of all of these drawings is to draw fast, or as fast as you conceivably can, really. So the idea is not, hey, be precise and meticulous. The idea is, try to be pretty rapid with these decisions. Try to make this go pretty fast, as quick as you possibly can, because that'll help to make things feel a bit more dimensionally sound. In addition, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we wanted to make this, feel a little bit more shiny. Like maybe there's a bit more of a reflective quality to, like where this turns. Like maybe it's a lacquered thing, and we can still make that decision even right now. We can just add a little bit more, like even across like here, and maybe over there we'll add that. Like there will be a potential edge of shininess. So if we want to make things feel shiny, we just have to determine like where our darkest part is. And so this is going to be the darkest part, because when you get shiny things, you often will get like that one really strong edge of it like reflecting things in the environment. So we'll add this really dark line right here, because then we'll come back in and we'll add some other values around it. But typically with really highly shiny reflective things, here, we'll put it over here. What it typically has is it has that one really dark edge, because that dark edge is where all of the qualities of an object, like a lot of the value of it, all kind of bunches and gathers in that area. So it tends to have a really dark edge to it. So we'll kind of add that really dark edge in there, and I'm going to bring a little bit more value around the top to make that roll, and then I'll add a couple more breaks in here in this pattern to make it look a little bit more wood fibrous. It's not bad. So you got to keep your white prisms pretty sharp. So sharpen them often to keep that point. So we'll give it a. Ideally, you could practice this part, before you get into. I think this is the top plane. Let's make that the top plane. That's the top. This is the top. And most of the time, I'm trying to butt this up against this dark line. Hopefully by now you've guessed why. If you haven't guessed why, it's texture. And it's contrast. So anytime you have areas of contrast, it's going to make things pop. Right? So I want to add this little bit of like, it's reflective. So typically you normally wouldn't do this. But because it's kind of a shiny surface, we're probably going to get a stronger light that bounces up on the bottom here to make that feel like it's a bit more reflective, or it's a bit more, it has a glossier surface to it, right? Because if you have shininess on the shadow side, there's a high probability that that's a really shiny surface, right? So again, we'll determine. Let's say our light source, and we'll just pretend like it's coming from this sort of angle. So then we'll come in and it will break this a couple times, so it's not perfect in there, and then we'll add in like, oh, let's hit the light more consistently in these areas. But in this sort of shiny reflective part, we'll just let it break a little bit, and then again over here we'll add in, hey, light. Same thing here. We'll just kind of go, yeah, let's give that a little edge of light. Let's give that a little edge of light. Little edge of light. So the idea though is that this stuff is supposed to provide a bit of fun, so you can just kind of explore some design ideas, but also just do something that's kind of interesting, that may be different than what you would normally do, but also just to explore like shape and decisions on how you manipulate shape and form. And if you want, you can always pop in like graphic shapes behind things. So let's say that you're losing this shape and you maybe don't want to go back in with a pen to tighten it up. You can come back in here and say, I want to add this graphic shape that adds that extra level of contrast. So it'll add one more level of contrast that'll help draw the eye. And then we'll just kind of fill that in. And that's all these graphic shapes are for. They're strictly just to create that one more level of contrast, to potentially pull the eye to look and go, ooh, what's that? That's cool. We could even, just for the sake of page design, and since we're adding contrast, we could pull this all the way through. Let's say we draw it all the way through here. That might have been too much. I feel like it's gonna group with that too much. And it's definitely gonna sort of group with the shadow parts over here, but that's all good. The only way you know it's bad is if you try it. Once you try it and you go, ooh, that's not good, you try to remember next time, like, yeah, don't do that. Although that's actually not bad. Oh, look at that, it's not bad. It's really not bad. So I'll just come in here and I'll just try to shore up that line a little bit more. Maybe we'll just add a little bit of edge there to say, hey, that's a darker part of that value. That's a little darker part there. Let's just add a little bit more transition in here to make our reflective area just feel a little bit shinier. A little bit shinier. And then you can, if you want, you could try to add like those sort of fake, like shiny lines in there. They go, ooh, that's shiny. Shiny! Like light just kind of ripped across there. Shiny! But again, that's just, practicing our texture, adding in our prisma so we can get that little bit of light to help make something bounce, simulating textures on these sort of weird organic forms, still thinking about light, dimension, giving things form, and figuring out how to start to apply these texture to these surfaces. Again, you can explore all the tools: Prismacolor, markers, white Prismacolor, pen. You got all of it. All of it's on the table now. So we're just adding in the white Prismacolor into this sort of mix, and so keep in mind that there is no specific. You have to start in any specific way. So if we wanted to, render some quick value, let's say we wanted to make this feel like it's this, really nice, super reflective, cylindrical volume, we could easily come in here and draw this quickly with our marker, and then come back in and shore up any sort of elements that we decided we wanted to shore up and give it a little bit more clarity and dimension. We could do that pretty quickly. But ideally, we always want to have an idea of like where we're going with this, and then the more that we have an idea of where we're going, the easier it will be. Keep in mind that anytime you have like really reflective surfaces, that you're more often than not going to end up with like this really dark like point where again all these values are going to gather. Like typically this is reflecting something in the environment. That's what this really dark line is. Sometimes you will get like another thinner line because it's also reflecting something else, but because it's turning form, that it doesn't have the same degree of reflection. And then sometimes you'll get that nice little edge, and then some of these value wise will be different. Oftentimes where the light is, you get a really stark contrast between where the light is and then where that darker part of that value is. So we'll end up with something that to a certain degree initially kind of looks like that, but then we can kind of go in and figure out that, hey, this is going to be the darkest, most the strongest contrasting part of that highly reflective surface. And then more often than not, like we won't have this really dark value anywhere else. Every once in a while we may have like an edge that gets peppered with it because it's also sort of turning form as well. Sometimes along the edge of where it's touching the ground, maybe we'll get something that's a bit more that's really strong and reflective as well. But we can definitely come right up against this and then create really strong contrast. And then especially if we have really metallic, reflective, chrome-like surfaces, we can easily come in here and put that really highly reflective element right next to that. And then transition, you know, some of our gray values back in and say that this, for the most part, is lumped in as one whole value. And again, our highest contrast area is right there. And we'll just kind of shore up some of the outside of this to give it clarity in its sort of structure. So let's give this a little bit more structure to it, structure to it, structure to it, structure to it. That's the top volume on that. And then we could even come in here and give this, you know, even more like linear marks to say that is shiny. That is shiny. And then we'll maybe add one more level of like, hey, what if the light is sort of bouncing back around over there? And then give this one more. I don't want those to be the same thickness. I shouldn't have made them that close in thickness. But that will kind of give that a sort of reflective quality to it. And then let's say we'll add a similar thing across the top, a flatter version of it. And let's get a bit more. Oh, I should have used this one. I should have went this one, the high contrast one. And then we'll put that little bit of shininess that says that that's reflecting something too. But maybe we'll go across this edge to say that, you know, light is hitting across that edge to make that feel shiny. Shiny. So we can quickly kind of make that feel like it has a sort of reflective, a shiny quality to it. And of course we can massage it more and more to give it a little bit more of a shininess or reflectiveness. You know, we could come in here with our Prismacolor and mess with it a little bit more to add a little bit more of a shininess to it. Because sometimes when you get these little lines that interrupt the surface, it'll help lend to the idea that there's other things in the environment that are reflecting as well. But at this point, we can mix up our materials. We can go to town. So the idea is to explore, you know, play around with these different textures, see how you can apply those to really organic shapes, and then come up with really fun and interesting sort of ideas. Play, and play, and play, and play.